Song of Solomon is a book that celebrates love. In fact, God created romantic love to be between a man and a woman, preferably for life. But what's interesting is tradition tells us that Solomon is the one writing this romantic love story. Now, I realize there's debate about who actually wrote this, but let's, for all pretenses and purposes, for the sake of this video, let's assume church tradition is right and Solomon wrote this book. There's a couple ideas here. Either Solomon, in the midst of him having 700 wives and 300 concubines, which was never God's design, he created Adam and Eve, not Adam, Eve, and Everly and Elizabeth. He created one man, one woman, and preferably for them to be partners for life. However, Solomon obviously began to pursue a vast amount of women. And as we think about Solomon's life in relation to the book of Song of Solomon, first of all, I want to realize that many women are turned off on Solomon because they view him as a player, as a womanizer. However, a lot of men are turned up and love this book because Solomon is like a player who has scored so many women. However, both of those perspectives should not be adapted. Solomon obviously was a fallen man. This book is inspired by God, so we need to treat it as the inspired text. We don't need to avoid it, although we might need to be cautious of allowing little children to read it right away, but you got to use your own discernment there as a parent. As we think about this book, scholars are wrestling with, is Solomon writing this in the context of the one woman he loved among the 1,000? Or is Solomon writing this as a imagination love affair that he never experienced? In other words, it's this idea that either Solomon is writing based upon the only one woman he truly loved and can never have, or he's never experiencing love in his life and writing about an imagination station where he meets this woman and actually falls in love. You know what? Our minds can wander either way. I tend to lean towards this is a book that Solomon is writing and recalling the time in which he actually loved someone and writing about it, and then how this love story points us to the relationship between Christ and his church. So yes, I would interpret this as a literal scene that took place in the life of Solomon, but it also points us symbolically to the love relationship that God has for his church. Now, you know what? We don't know exactly when Solomon wrote this, but we can just estimate maybe around 950 BC to 970 BC. A lot of times it's called Song of Solomon, or it's called Song of Songs. It's kind of like when we think about the King of Kings, this is the King of all kings. When we read this book, it is a song of all songs that Solomon likely wrote down. It is a poetic celebration of love, romance, courtship, marriage, and intimacy between husband and wife. Remember, God created husbands and wives and brought them together in a holy union we call marriage. While some throughout church history have interpreted the book allegorically, like I said, most evangelical scholars understand it first and foremost as a celebration of God's design for romantic love and marriage, while also recognizing the broader theological implications concerning God's love for his people. So as you read this book, please remind yourself, set aside all of Solomon's fallenness and his sinfulness of being a womanizer and sleeping with way too many women, and think of it as this is a beautiful picture of love. You know, some people even think that Solomon didn't even write it because Solomon, in the pursuit of all his love affairs, he never actually experienced love. So how could he write this if he never truly experienced love? Well, like I said, that's debatable, but what we do know is this book points us to Jesus Christ. The big idea here is God created romantic love, marriage, and intimacy to be enjoyed within the covenant relationship between a husband and a wife. As we walk through this book together, we'll see the first section is coming from chapters 1 and 2, where the courtship begins. The Shulamite's admiration. The bride begins to express her love and admiration for the writer, which we're going to call Solomon. Then in chapter 2, The beginning part begins to describe this growing affection between these two. The couple delights in one another's beauty and character and presence. And so, as we think about this scene, love begins with attraction, admiration, and delight. As we move forward, the next part of chapter 2 into chapter 3 talks about the pursuit of love. You can't just sit there and wait for uh, a bride or a groom to just drop out of the sky and land on your front porch. That has to be pursued. And then here we read about how the lover arrives. The beloved eagerly pursues his bride. There's a longing and desire in the beginning of chapter 3 where the bride expresses her deep desire to be with the one she loves. Here we see healthy love includes longing, anticipation, and pursuit. Not one amidst the others, but really all three combined. Then in chapters 3 into chapter 5, we read about the wedding celebration, which, by the way, were a lot different in the ancient world. Today, we have like a 3 or 5 hour wedding celebration, like a whole afternoon or evening. Well, in the ancient world, they would spend a week or two sometimes celebrating this festive sovereign gathering between a man and a woman in holy matrimony. The bride's beauty is praised in chapter 4. The groom praises his bride's beauty and character. Then you have the marital intimacy is celebrated, and the marriage relationship is consummated. And so as we think about this section, marriage is God's ordained context for romantic intimacy. God created it, so let's celebrate it in its right context. As we move forward to the fourth section, we read about the challenges and the deepening of love, chapters 5 through 6. You have this idea of temporary separation in chapter 5. Misunderstanding often creates tension in relationships, and such was the case in this one. Then you have in chapter 6 renewed appreciation. The couple reaffirms their love and commitment to each other, and then it breeds a renewed appreciation. Strong relationships will always endure difficulties and grow stronger in the process. As we move forward to chapter 7 and 8, we read section 5 is about mature covenant love. We read in chapter 7 about the joy of married love. The husband and wife continue delighting in one another. And that is a beautiful thing that God has created. Then moving forward in chapter 8, we read about the growing commitment, that their love matures beyond mere attraction. It goes deeper into the emotional being of those people. Healthy love will always deepen over time. And lastly, we read about the power and permanence of love at the ending of chapter 8. Love is as strong as death, and man, it can sting, and man, it can heal. In other words, it can kill you if your heart's broken, and it can heal you if your heart is glad. We read about the final expressions of love in the book, where it concludes with continued devotion and anticipation beyond that. True covenant love is powerful. It lasts, it endures, and it cannot be bought with money. It's priceless. And those who find it in this life are truly rich. So in chapters 1 and 2, we read about the courtship and attraction. Chapters 2 and 3, we read about the pursuit and desire. Chapters 3 through 5, we read about marriage and intimacy. Chapter 4, the challenges of growth. In chapters 5 through 6, number 4. And then in number 5, or chapters 7 through 8, we read about the enduring covenant of love. Obviously, the major themes involve romance, marriage, covenant faithfulness in marriage, purity, intimacy, beauty, faithfulness, and God's design for relationships and specifically marriage. But what's interesting is I believe that this book points us to Jesus Christ in a very specific way. While Solomon, or the Song of Solomon, primarily celebrates human marriage on earth, the New Testament frequently uses marriage as a picture of Christ's relationship with His church. We read about that in Ephesians chapter 5. How Christ sacrificially and selflessly gave his life for the church. And He's called us to lay down our lives for our wives. Christ is the ultimate bridegroom. The church is His bride. And marriage points beyond itself to a greater love between Christ and His redeemed people. What a beautiful picture. As we think about some main takeaways today, number 1, romantic love is God's good design. Number 2, love requires commitment. You've got to commit. It's like jumping out of an airplane with a parachute. You just got to commit. There will be risks. But if it's true love that is centered around God, it will endure. And then thirdly, Marriage reflects a greater reality. That is, husband and wife, their love points us to the amazing love God has for you and me. Song of Solomon celebrates God's design for romantic love, marriage, intimacy, and a lifelong covenant commitment between one husband and one wife. And that's what Song of Solomon is all about. Have a blessed day.